SSRIs have been the mainstay since the 1960s. And unfortunately, clinical practice is behind research. This giant meta-analysis came out where researchers looked at all of the data about altering serotonin with antidepressants and its clinical efficacy. And they found that there was no correlation between serotonin levels and anxiety and depression. So suddenly we are discovering that our hypothesis has been wrong the entire time. 95% of our serotonin is actually made in our gut by our gut microbiome. And so when we take a medication that's altering these serotonin levels, not only are we changing the chemicals in our brain, but we're changing the composition in our gut.
What are some of the repercussions? And you mentioned gut microbiome, immune system, hormones. What are some of the downstream repercussions that should be talked about more when someone is put on an SSRI?
Yeah, SSRIs have been the mainstay since the 1960s. And unfortunately, clinical practice is behind research. And so it kind of started with, we discovered enteramine, which is serotonin in the gut. And then they started experimenting with it. And then they gave it to animal studies with stress and anxiety. And in some of the animal studies, more serotonin resulted in less stress and anxiety. And there became a hypothesis of, more serotonin, more happy, less anxiety, less serotonin, less happy, more anxiety. And then the pharmaceutical company developed Prozac, which was our first mood-altering serotonin-modifying medication. And that hit the mainstream market, and they just cruised. I remember when I was in my master's degree, is we got lunches and prizes and presents, and I still have erasers and pencils with Lexapro written on them.
Jeez.
The marketing was just insane. It was such a huge profitable thing. But then in 2022, this giant meta-analysis came out where researchers looked at all of the data about altering serotonin with antidepressants and its clinical efficacy. And they found that there was no correlation between serotonin levels and anxiety and depression. So suddenly we are discovering that our hypothesis has been wrong the entire time. More serotonin is not necessarily better, and less serotonin is not necessarily worse. So we get to ask, I think, more interesting questions, which gets to your point of, well, what are the consequences? What is occurring? And we could take two routes. One is maybe somebody is, let's say, just a biological purist, and they have anxiety and they haven't taken any medications, but they have long-term chronic effects from the anxiety being unmanaged that we could totally dig into. And then in the other pathway is those individuals who got put on an antidepressant, and what are the different long-term effects that could have. We'll start with the medication person first, because that was your question. I think many of us are experiencing that. So the first thing is when we'll kind of stick with Zoloft because it's a more common selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an SSRI, is that Zoloft will change the amount of serotonin reuptake in the brain. And it's kind of like if I am used to drinking a gallon of water every single day, and then the next day I just out of the blue drink hardly any, I may suffer from water withdrawal more so than somebody who is used to not drinking much water and their body's adapted. We're constantly trying to create homeostasis. So the body gets used to having its serotonin levels managed by an outside source. So now we have these artificially elevated serotonin levels. And one of the number one side effects of SSRIs is digestive upset. And it's right there on the side effects label. We go to drugs.com, you type in your antidepressant in the search bar, we see gastrointestinal changes. And it's interesting, right? Because most of our serotonin is actually made in our gut. 95% of our serotonin is actually made in our gut by our gut microbiome. And so when we take a medication that's altering these serotonin levels, not only are we changing the chemicals in our brain, but we're changing the composition in our gut. And when we change the composition in our gut, not only are we changing the specific bacteria in the gut, but we're changing the way those bacteria regulate our hormones. We're changing the way those bacteria regulate our immune system. And so it can make a really big difference from head to toe. And that's why it can be really difficult for people to taper down on their medications. And some people get really difficult times where they get breakthrough symptoms and worse anxiety and worse panic and worse depression as they're trying to come off of these medications. So why does that actually happen is when we take that chemical change from the medication and we introduce it to our own genetics, our own environmental factors, our own nutrition, our environmental exposures like mold or metals or food additives, then those interactions are going to change and vary per person. So we can totally dive into specific examples together. The last piece I think I was expressing is that when we are used to taking an antidepressant, that when we then try to taper off of it, our gut has adapted to that drug, our immune system has adapted to that drug, everything has created homeostasis around that, and it can be really difficult to then taper off, and people get really terrible withdrawal that makes it in some cases almost impossible.
And that's a great, segue into one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, because there are millions of people out there right now that are on SSRIs, all of these different antidepressants and medications that are trying to get off. They've maybe listened to podcasts like these, or listening to conversations, or doing their own research. They know how the side effects are just really awful, and they're trying to get off. So what are some of the first steps that someone can take holistically, and what's some practical advice for them?
I would do a two-step process. The first step would be to identify the root cause of why you had the symptoms to begin with, because right now they're being palliated. It's like if I have high blood pressure and I take a blood pressure medication, it's not treating the root cause of the blood pressure, it's suppressing it. And then if you miss a dose of it, your blood pressure goes high. And so whatever the reason was for the anxiety, if that hasn't been treated, like you were saying with that metaphor of learning to swim, if you haven't built up those muscles to learn how to swim,
right,
that cause will still be there and your symptoms will come back as you come off the medication. But the second thing is that we have to correct the imbalances that the medications are causing.
That's right.
And so I think that a twofold approach is really important. And I would actually do them in that order: is start treating the root cause first while you have those floaties on. And then we start to fix everything else so you can start taking the floaties off.